Hey Wargamers, welcome back to the channel, Death from Above Wargaming. I'm Aaron and I am back. I'm back in the studio. It has been some time, a little bit of a hiatus. I was under the weather with the big nasty virus, but I'm back in action, coming at you with some exciting new content. In fact, we got a whole bunch of exciting things lined up for you guys. This week, I'm out of quarantine. Kevin is coming back to the studio. In a few days, we're going to be filming a battle report. Very exciting. And it will be the first time, guys, over the holiday, did some investment thanks to our patrons. And now we've got 3 additional GoPros set up in the studio. We've got a bird's eye view. We've got a couple of different angles. So we'll be doing a multi-camera angle battle report. So very excited to try that out. We've got brand new terrain, some great stuff from Hardware Studios. So really excited to show that off. In addition, we will be doing a series on terrain, so a deep dive into some of those buildings and terrain pieces that we have from Hardware Studios, from Xmarks, and some of the other miscellaneous things that we have on the table that you guys frequently ask about. And then, of course, tonight, my magnum opus, what I've been working on over the holidays, is Alpha Strike Battlytics. This is huge. It's brand new. It's a full, flat-out game of Alpha Strike. It's pretty cool. So we're going to dive into that tonight. I'm going to tell you all about it. And you can use this in a variety of different ways, right? We can compare 2 different lances or stars to see how they stack up. We can compare, for example, a lance against a fixed opponent and swap units in and out to see which ones perform better, right? Which ones bring up the overall efficiency of the entire star or lance. We can do all sorts of cool stuff with it. Tonight, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at 2 of the brand new box sets. The Inner Sphere Command Lance versus the Inner Sphere Battle Lance. If I tweak the skill levels just a little bit, I got them within 1 point value. So they're going to be facing off and we're going to see which one gets you a little bit more bang for the buck. So we're going to dive in. We're going to look at each individual unit. We're going to look at overall lance performance. We're going to see how they move, what the engine was doing, what it was thinking, what roles I set it up in, and why. So guys, it is really exciting. I'm really thrilled to bring this to you. So stay tuned. Our first Alpha Strike Battlytics coming right up. All right, guys, let's dive into this first Battlytics analysis, this lance-on-lance review that we have here. So as I go through this, I'm going to explain a little bit what happens behind the scenes, what we're looking at, and why. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at all of the metrics associated with one force, then we're going to look at the other one, and then finally we'll do some comparison side by side at the end. We're going to start with our Inner Sphere Command Lance. Now, if you went out and you bought that box set, for example, from our friend Derek over at Aries Games Miniatures, you would get a Marauder, an Archer, a Valkyrie, and a Stinger. So what I did was I took a look at Succession Wars era designs and I pieced together a lance for a point value of 129. So here's what I did. I had a Marauder 3R. This is very staple. It's one of my favorite Marauders to field. It has very, very strong long-range damage, excellent medium-range damage. It has an overheat value of 1, and it's really tough. 6 armor, 6 structure. It's hard to bring down. The Archer is a 2R, very similar in terms of damage profile to that Marauder. It's got 1 more point of armor, still has that overheat, so very good there. The Valkyrie, not a lot of options. I mean, you've got the QA. It's what I took. It's good for a 30-ton mech, right? It's got 3 pips of armor, 3 pips of structure. Damage is solid. It's priced right. It moves 5. It does have jump jets. Overall, very solid design. And then the Stinger, I took the 3G. It is priced identically to its cousin. However, this one has the ENE ability, and it has none of the, there's nothing else that you lose. So there's no reason you wouldn't take the 3G in this era, unless, of course, there was some lore reason or something that you would take. I believe the 3R is the other variant. So Stinger, it's it's hot garbage. I mean, it's really, it's not that fast. You know, a 6.9 mech with jump jets, it sounds fast on paper, but the TMM is still 2, so it's just as susceptible as like a Wolverine or that Valkyrie in terms of, you know, getting hit. And it's only got 4 total pips of armor and structure, so very, very fragile. It is only 14 points, but frankly, those are 14 points I'd rather stick into a vehicle or something along those lines. But we are looking at this particular unit, so we went with the Stinger, and it's just, it is what it is. Now you'll notice underneath the title of the mech, there is a role, and then there's a skill level. So the Marauder, for example, it says Vanguard and Veteran 3. So it's a skill 3 veteran, and Vanguard is something specific to the tool, to Battlytics. There are a variety of roles. What I try to do is think about how I play a mech, right? How I play on the tabletop, and then I sort of boiled that down. These inform the behavior of the mech. So as the model is running, right, and as it's sort of learning, it has sort of a default posture based on, right, and it weights different things based on the role. The things that it looks at, for example, when it wants to make a move, it looks at how close am I to the target, right? What kind of damage can I do to the target, right? Getting closer may not be better. Getting closer may be, in fact, fantastic. It looks at how close am I to supporting fire. So it does want to, in some roles, maintain overall unit cohesion. It looks at things like how close am I to incoming enemy fire. If it moves into a position where it's taking fire from every enemy unit, that's less ideal than if it can move out here, put 3 units out of range, and have line of sight to its target, right? It looks at, so a whole variety of things, right? Basically, it's taking a look at. And based on its role, it weights different things, the behavior, right, differently, and that informs how the mech will move and what it'll shoot, and so on and so forth. A Vanguard mech is basically like your frontline mech. This thing is going to move in. It sort of wants to be close to its allies. It wants to get as many targets, you know, in its scopes as it can, right? It is your sort of tank role where it is out front, taking fire, and really taking down its target as best as it can. So the Marauder in that Vanguard role, the Archer also in a Vanguard role. And some of you may be like, whoa, Aaron, this is a fire support mech. But it's not. You know, it does really good. I mean, an Alpha Strike, right? You're looking at a 2-3-3-2 mech. It has an overheat value of 1. You want to get this thing into medium range. You don't want to sit it out at long range and leave it there. You're leaving the overheat on the table. It's extremely tough. Even your Garden Variety Archer and Classic, I mean, I think that you don't want to sit that mech at 21 inches and shoot your LRMs. You want to get in. You want to get those medium lasers into play. So anyway, that's the Archer. The Valkyrie I have in a pursuit role. So this one was a point of contention. I kept flipping its roles from a fire support role into a pursuit role. It wasn't performing particularly well in a fire support role, and that's because it doesn't have extreme range. That long range damage is only 1 point. So I just wanted to get it in as quickly as possible, hoping that the Marauder and the Archer would soak some fire, and this thing would be able to wreak a little bit of havoc. So we'll see how that turns out. The Stinger, I put in a strike role. So strike is typically something where you're gonna, it's going to, when it deploys, it typically tries to deploy that on the flanks, and then it will close in. The strike role is less concerned about a specific target and more concerned about just getting damage on enemy mechs. So it will still try to find an optimum target, but it does, again, it's not going to just blindly chase something around. It is going to consider all of its options, even if there's a less optimal target. And I chose that for this mech because it dies so quickly. I need to get damage on the board as quickly as possible. So I figured putting it on the outside and starting it in that position would be ideal. Okay, so on the right side, we see some force metrics. So what are force metrics? Well, the green line is just essentially sort of like your general power bar, like how good is this thing in various categories. So across the top, I have some icons. You have your engine, which represents the average speed of the unit. So fairly fast, right? It's about a 4.8 average speed for this unit. The next two, the shield is armor, and that sort of hex bolt screw thing is internal structure. So you can see that these are about an average of 4.5 and maybe a little under 4.5, 4.3 for the structure. So The Stinger, the Valkyrie, obviously pulling those numbers down a little bit, but overall, I mean, that's not bad. You know, a 5.5 mech is still pretty tough. The next one is pilot skill, so the lower the better. This has an average skill of 3.3. That Stinger is a skill 4, so it is bringing the overall lance average up a little bit. And the last one is firepower. So this is this is like average weighted damage. So this is inspired by the way they calculate PV from damage. When that happens, when you calculate the PV from damage, it looks at short range, it looks at twice your medium range value, and it looks at your long range. I also take into consideration extreme range at 50% of its total value because that's part of the game. And then I also bake in a second sort of part of that equation where it looks at your overheat value. And I've assigned some math there to sort of based on how often you're able to bring that overheat to bear, if you have overheat long, and so on and so forth. So this sort of average weighted damage is a blended value of how much firepower this lance can bring to bear. And this is at a 2.4, which is not bad. The donut charts on the right represent the percentage of damage at different range brackets. So you can kind of see there the medium range is generally the highest, followed by long and then short. So that tells me if I want to play this lance correctly, I'm going to be dealing the bulk of my damage earlier in the game at long and medium range. I need to capitalize then. I need to find my shots. If I let the opponent close to short range, I might find myself outgunned if it's a strong short range lance. And then in the bottom right, what we're looking at here, this is just a representation of the percent of PV associated with each mech. So you can see the Marauder makes up 32% roughly of the overall PV of the lance. So for 129 points, that Marauder's 42 points, roughly 32.6% and so on. So you can see we're very, very invested in that Marauder and the Archer. The Valkyrie, the Stinger making up just a very small portion of the overall lance. So that's sort of our general intro. Now what we're going to do is we're going to dive in basically mech by mech. We're going to look at a variety of statistics and metrics on how they performed in the simulations. And then we'll look at the overall, lance again and sort of blended metrics, and then we'll move into Force 2. So the first thing you'll notice here, I've got this lance tagged as a House Steiner Lyran Commonwealth lance here. I actually have a almost completely painted a Donegal Guards command lance set up like this, and you'll see that the battle lance that we're going to look at I have set up for the Draconis Combine. Lots of House Corita variants buried in there. So when we get there, you'll see that. But first of all, let's talk about this Marauder. So we just talked about the stats. Again, solid performer. So let's move into that, that left-hand side where it says core battle metrics, and let's talk about what this area chart means. These are very important. These basically tell you how the mech performs in the battle. The yellow represents the damage that it dealt. The red represents the damage that it received. You'll note that at the end, when we compare the total damage dealt across all the mechs in the game and the total damage received across all the mechs in the game, they're equal. And they should be, because if you're ever dealing more damage than something is taking, your simulation is not working. Speaking of simulations, I ran this one 5,000 times. So normally in classic Battlytics, we run it 10,000 times. It usually runs in a matter of, a minute or so. This one takes about a little less than a second per simulation because there's so much more happening. There are so many decisions made for, 8 to 10 different mechs, on this battle grid. So, 10,000 simulations would take a few hours or whatever. So I did 5,000 to start. You get pretty good convergence in the data at that point. So anyway, I digress. The red area, we talked about that. That's the damage taken. The yellow bars represent the heat that the mech is building up. And that white dotted line is the average of damage taken and received. Remember, those numbers are identical. So this line represents the average sort of line of demarcation that your average mech is both giving and receiving. So just eyeballing this, what we can see is the Marauders outperforming the average. It's doing a lot more damage from the very beginning. It's also taking a ton. Once that thing gets into turn 5, which is probably medium range, it's just taking a blistering amount of damage. So we'll talk about movement in a second. You'll see some movement diagrams in the middle there. I'll talk about that. But before we get there, there's some more icons on the right of the core battle metrics. The first one represents your average range to target throughout turns 2 to 10. I don't count turn 1 because everybody's at maximum range, and it sort of skews the statistic a little bit. So if we're looking at this thing at 12.5 inches, it's really doing a good job of staying at medium range. That shows me that the intelligent engine is doing what it's supposed to be doing. It doesn't really want to get to short range because it loses a point of damage. Even if your target number is higher, it's better. And, again, it's comparing what the opponent can do to me, right? It's saying, hey, 12.5 is optimum. So this thing is going to be floating at that range and trying to maneuver intelligently to stay there. Total damage dealt, 9.7 points of damage over the 10 turns. And then damage received is 10.2. So it's taking a little more than it is receiving. The next two metrics, right, you'll see the little crosshairs and then sort of the exploding circle. The crosshairs represents the number of critical hits this mech has dealt. The one below it represents the number of critical hits this mech has taken. So roughly equal, 2.8 critical hits delivered, 2.5 points of, or 2.5 critical hits soaked, and that's in a 10-turn game average. So over those 5,000 simulations, remember these are all blended numbers. All right, so moving down, what we've got here is the white donut chart. This is survivability. So in those 5,000 games, right, how many of them did it survive? And, it's at 29.5%. That's not too shabby when you're sending this mech up the gut. In fact, that's pretty good. The yellow pie slice represents, out of all 8 mechs on the table, right, because there were 8 in this particular analysis, what percent of damage is this mech delivering? The purple slice represents, out of all the mechs on the table, right, what's the percent PV that this mech took up? These are important statistics, right? This is like your bang for the buck. Remember, we don't really care that much about how much damage it took, because if it's dying, it's not going to be delivering damage. So that's all sort of cooked into these really two important metrics. So we see that this mech, 18% of the overall damage was dealt by this mech, and it only took up 16.3% of the total PV on the table. That's pretty good. That armor analysis in the middle is pretty cool. This really shows the armor degradation on average over time in a 10-turn game. That little crosshairs represents the point at which you're crossing the threshold from armor to structure. So we can see this thing really around turn 6, turn 7, which corresponds with the core battle metrics where the red area spikes up. You can see that's where it starts flipping over and that armor kind of melts off pretty quickly. Early in the game, consistently this mech does very well. It's not taking a lot of fire. Its armor's holding up, and then once it gets into the late game, you can see it sort of starts falling apart at the seams there. The last chart that I'll mention on this one is the efficiency rating. So what we're looking at here, it's pretty cool. It actually trends the efficiency over every turn of the game. And you can see early on, the efficiency spikes way up, right? Because it's outperforming. Again, that dotted white line is the average efficiency for the mech. So you can see it spikes up way high. This mech doing, really good early turns, getting the damage in. It starts to level out, and it ends the game at 110.2%. So in this sort of iteration of Battlytics, we're not scoring efficiency on a scale from 1 to 10. I found that was very unreliable because any given mech in any given scenario with different mechs, it's going to change dramatically. If I run the same simulation with the same mechs, very reliable, I'll get the same numbers. But if I switch the lance out from a battle lance to a command star, the efficient, or if the point values change or they're unequal, that efficiency score is basically meaningless. So what we're looking at here is, instead of percentage, right, that actually remains fairly consistent as long as those PV numbers are balanced, right? What we're looking at here is, what's the percent damage that I was able to deliver for the percent that it actually cost me to field this mech, right? So it's all relative to what you're fielding and what the other guy's fielding and how much you're able to deliver with this mech. So 110%, pretty good. Again, the average mech was 86.1% in this lance. So I think 100% is a good number. You're getting a good ROI. You know, anything less than that, in the 90s is maybe okay. Once you're at 86, 85, that's really when you want to question like what's happening. But this Marauder, a solid performer here. So just a little digression on efficiency here. Again, we're going through this sort of first one a little bit more slowly so you guys understand what you're looking at here. All right, in the middle, what you see, and you'll see this for both lances that we analyze, I took a sample. This is just a sample. It's not average of one of the games and the movement that the mechs made in that particular game. Okay. Why don't I average it? Well, if you average their movement over 5,000 games, and considering deployment is intelligent, meaning it deploys them in different spots, right? So it rolls randomly, right? Like player 1 wins, that means player 2 has to deploy a guy, and then this, you know, says, which one do I want to deploy? I think this one's best. Where do I want to put it here? Every game, the deployment looks a little bit different. So what happens is you end up with basically a line across the middle. I tried it because it just averages, you know, the movement over all of these games, and you basically just end up with a blob in the middle. It doesn't tell you anything. So what I did was I took a sample, and I store about 10 different games, and I kind of scroll through them and take a look at which one is, I think, representative of the most. So what you'll see here is the red lines are the OPFOR, the white lines are your allies, the green line is the mech that we are examining in this particular screen, so in this case the Marauder. And what you can see, it's very interesting. So this thing kind of moves into the middle, it makes a turn up, and then it kind of hangs out in that middle position, moving back and forth, trying to optimize its shot. And so that's kind of what this Marauder is doing. And if you look over multiple games, what you see is that it really does an excellent job of trying to maintain distance, but also make sure that it's close enough that it can use that overheat. And you can see late game, if you go back to the core battle metrics, the heat is there. It is making great use of the overheat ability. So pretty cool stuff there. All right, so on the right side, we're looking at force metrics. So this is going to be consistent for this screen and every screen for this particular command lance that we look at. Survivability. All we want to look at here is we would just want to eyeball the Marauder's survivability, which is in green, to all of its lance mates, which are in white. So you can see, you know, it's that archer up at the top. That one is doing very good. The other two lighter mechs, doing a lot worse, dying a lot sooner, and that archer, you know, the survivability curve, very consistent with that armor degradation. So again, this is just sort of a point of reference. The next chart down, the yellow and red bars are basically the core battle metrics. If you sum them up, and we put the damage dealt and the damage soaked side by side for each mech, this is what you get. So, you know, at a glance, we can see the Marauder taking the largest portion of damage out of everybody on the lance. The Marauder doing a pretty good job of dealing damage as well. So, you know, excellent there. You know, if you look at the Stinger, it's barely doing damage and it's taking, you know, a decent amount, not doing so hot. So this is, again, a quick point of reference for us if we want to dive into the data a little bit more. And then at the bottom, what we're looking at is the efficiency, again, the comparison from, you know, one lance mate to the next. So we can see that the Marauder is definitely doing well. The white dashes that go across is the average lance efficiency. So you'll notice the average lance efficiency here is 79.8%. The average in the bottom right is for the whole battle grid, right? Every unit on the board, 86.1%. So this lance, a little bit lower, right, than the overall average, which means the other lance is going to be higher. But this Marauder doing very well, again at 110%, outperforming, you know, the Valkyrie and the Stinger by a large margin. But the Archer obviously doing a little bit better there, as you can tell by that chart. So I know that was a lot. We're going to dive into the Archer. Let's take a look at that. All right, cool. So we'll try to blow through this one a little bit more quickly. Couple things about this Archer. So again, it's a skill 3. It's not cheap. 47 points. It's the most expensive mech on this force. Core battle metrics look great. It is way outperforming in terms of damage. It does really well at soaking as well, up until about turn 7, turn 8, turn 9, where it really starts to take a lot of fire. But again, this thing has thick armor plates. It is making decent use of its overheat. Its average range a little bit closer than the Marauder at 12 inches. But again, it's doing 12.7 points of damage, and it's soaking 7. So that Marauder is taking the majority of the heat here, but this Archer is making great use of that opportunity. In terms of criticals, I thought this was standout. It's doing 3.4 critical hits while it's only taking 1.3. And most of those crits, when I dug into it, a lot of that, that sort of decimal there is through armor critical hits. You can see, based on the armor degradation below, it doesn't get through 7 points of armor on average until about turn 9, turn 10. So it's not until the very, very end of the game, likely after that Marauder's been knocked out of commission, that the guns turn on that Archer and start to generate crits. But again, very few, only 1.3. Survivability on this mix, very high, 67.5%. It's doing 23.5% of the damage, almost doing a quarter of the damage, and there are 8 mechs on the table. So that's pretty impressive. And it takes about 18.3% of the overall point value on the table. In terms of how this thing is doing for efficiency, it's 128.4% at the end. So it's almost, 50% higher than the baseline at 86.1. It's doing very well, both in terms of all the units on the table and in terms of individually, its lance mates as well. Now, if you look at the center movement, you can see this thing is just absolutely, just unabashedly running into traffic, as it should be. It's making a nice sweeping maneuver up the battle grid. It's taking on basically everything. You'll notice that Phoenix Hawk basically stays with it. I think the Phoenix Hawk picks it up as a target in this particular simulation and just runs with the Archer, but the Archer does not care. The Archer is just dealing the damage and laying down the pain. So this thing, it's an excellent mech. It does really well in this simulation, and just overall a staple for this Command Lance. And I'm very excited it's in the Legendary pack as well, because now I have like a ton of them. So that's the Archer, looking real good. All right, so next up is our Valkyrie. I personally love the Valkyrie. I think it's a phenomenal mech. I think it's a workhorse. I think you can do a lot with it. It's not easy to take out. 6 pips in total. 4 will put it into forced withdrawal. But regardless, eating through 3 points of armor, it's like a commitment. You gotta commit to it. So how does it do on the core battle metrics? Unfortunately, it does not do as well as I wanted, and I wonder if I put it in the wrong role. So basically, I can set the number of simulations, right? So I'm not going to run 5,000, and have it take an hour and a half or 2 hours and then come back and look. Like typically I'll run 30 or 40 simulations and I'll get an idea of like, is this thing behaving the way I want in this specific role? Should I switch it? And I went through it, like I said earlier, it was contentious. I went through it like a bunch of times, and I kept switching its role between more of a fire support, like second line role, where it's either hanging in the back or it's a little more conservative, but it wasn't really doing the damage, so I put it in a pursuit role. I finally was like, all right, forget it, I'm just doing it. But this is what happens. But, when the mechs look at targets, just like you would, the things that it looks for is like, what can I kill outright? What can I generate a crit on? Like, what can I really mess up quickly? And it looks at average calculated damage and probability to hit and all of this stuff. So if that Valkyrie gets too close and it's an easy shot for somebody to just overheat and kill it, they're going to take the shot and knock this thing out of commission. And that is sort of the risk of, a lighter mech. Anyway, so you can see it is just about performing to average in terms of damage output up until about turn 5. And then it falls off. And that's probably because it's dying a lot of the time, candidly. And if you look at the armor degradation, you can see it tanks, very quickly. Right around turn 5, it's almost completely out. So most of the time, it's probably dead. Damage soaked, 6.1 points. I mean, listen, it's, it's only got 6 pips, so the 0.1 is probably, when somebody overheats to kill it. But at the end of the day, the reality is this thing is doing its job. It's a 26-point mech. It's getting in there. It's dealing some damage. If we look at the overall stats, it's only 10% of the total PV pool. It's doing 6.2% of the damage. I could probably use a few more points out of it, but at the end of the day, it feels to me like slightly underperformed. And if we look at the efficiency rating, you can see early game it's outperforming the average, and then it just tanks because it doesn't have that survivability. So again, I wonder if it's on me for putting it in the wrong role and just having it behave a little too aggressively. But again, if it focuses too much on survivability, it's just not laying down the damage. So I feel like it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another. Anyway, total efficiency on this one, 61.5%. If we look at the movement in the center, it's staying with its lance mates. It's focused on, getting in, getting that damage down. But you can see it just sort of hits a wall, and it just basically, it runs into, I think, some traffic, and it just doesn't, it's unable to withstand, the barrage from the Rifleman and the Warhammer and all of these other big mechs that you have in the Battle Lance. I think as soon as they turn their guns on it, it's pretty much toast. So that's that. I mean, it's slightly under average for the Lance. Again, I really want this thing to perform better. I think that it can, maybe in the right situation, but in this particular simulation, with the spread of targets, it doesn't really hold up. And it's an interesting point of note, right? I picked the Command Lance and the Battle Lance to square up because, one, I thought it would be fun because they're new and it's exciting. But if I was building a Lance, I would probably never put these mechs together. I might put the Valkyrie in a Lance with a Stinger and a Locust and a Javelin or something like that. But and I might put the Valkyrie in a Lance with, like, swap the Stinger out for another Heavy or like a Wolverine or something along those lines. Something else that's fast and that can get in and draw fire. But I think the Valkyrie's in sort of this weird spot in this Lance where, it's not that fast. Again, it's like the Stinger. Like a TMM2's not that fast. It's not enough to keep it alive. So if that Warhammer just looks at it funny and it really wants to kill it, I mean, it's just all it's got to do is just overheat, pull the trigger, and this thing's pretty much toast. All right, let's move on to the Stinger. I don't know. I mean, it's a fun mech. It's very flavorful. It's iconic. The ENE probably helps it a little bit, but not really. It just doesn't have the damage output. I mean, a 1-1 is abysmal. This thing is basically an infantry hunter, and you can see how quickly it dies. It's not even like it's surviving to the late game. And I did try to put this thing in a second line role. Second line is essentially where the AI will hold it back intentionally. It has it sort of like skirt the deployment edge and tries to keep it out of line of fire until other mechs are picked up as targets, and then it tries to rush in. It just doesn't matter because this thing can't hit anything at long range, so it's just floating out there doing nothing. And as soon as it pops its head up, the Rifleman, the Warhammer, even the Phoenix Hawk, I mean, they're just going to maul this thing, and there's nothing it can do about it with 4 pips of armor. On the bright side, I mean, it is getting close. It is getting, on average, in the simulations, right? The one that I have in the center here, it doesn't look like it made it past. It looks like it died on turn 4. But on average, in the 5,000 simulations, right, it was getting to 3 inches of its target. So it was picking something. It was sprinting in. It was trying to lay down some fire. But you can see, 0.6 points of damage over the 10 turns on average. I mean, some games it's not even doing damage. It's just awful. And that's because, again, I mean, you look at this example in the middle, judging by the distance between the points, right? It's like sprinting, and then it, does a standard move and shoots, and then it's dead, right? And that's probably the, the lifespan of the Stinger as we know it. It is what it is. And again, if I didn't state this center battle grid here is representative of our normal 48 by 48 inch table. So this is actually a 48 by 48 scatter plot, and it plots the average XY coordinates for each of the units. Anyway, So the Stinger, you know, it's not dealing crits. It's taking a lot of crits. It's taking some damage, but, you know, not even really enough to be, you know, notable. And then, you know, it's just getting overkilled almost every time. And then if we look at the, you know, armor and critical analysis, again, that sort of armor degradation, it just plummets so quickly. So quickly. I mean, it's like, hey guys, and then blam, it's dead. It didn't survive, guys. 0% survivability. That means in 5,000 games, it died in every single one. Maybe that's not surprising. I think it's funny. It did 1.1% of the overall damage, takes up 5.4% of the PV. So that is not a good return on investment. That's a 19.3% on the efficiency. Just not a great choice when you blend these ultra tiny mechs with almost no damage and, you know, not a whole lot of armor with these big bruisers. It's just a recipe for disaster. All right, so let's check out the final look here, the sort of IS Command Lance core metrics, if you will, blended across all of these 4 mechs. So again, at the top left, we just have sort of our power meter, just to remind us where we're at. You know, we have an average speed, a little over average speed unit. Armor and structure, a little bit above average. Skill is about right on point. Damage wasn't fantastic, but, you know, not terrible either. If we look at the core battle metrics, what we're really looking for is like the difference between the yellow and the red, and you can see they're almost entirely overlapped. You can see that the red eclipses the yellow, especially in those mid-turns like 5, 6, 7, and then they kind of level out again. So how does that pan out? Well, it does 26.4 points of damage. The lance soaked 27.7. Took more than it dealt. In terms of the criticals, though, it dealt out more criticals than it received by a small margin. I think if the Stinger wasn't there, that might look a little better. The overall survivability of this particular lance, 25.7%. And then as far as how it did with the, you know, in comparison to the battle lance, it did 48.8% of the overall damage that was dealt in the game. It took 51.2%. Again, that's sort of a corollary or just a different look at what we just talked about. And it had 50.2% of the PV. So I think this was a difference of 1 PV between the two lances, so relatively equal. When we look at the overall lance efficiency, again, you know, it's at that 79.8%. I might have said 76 earlier, but that's my old man eyes going. But 79.8%, you know, and again, the average was 86.1. So how did this lance do overall? Well, it didn't do bad. You know, again, that sort of, it's right on par with efficiency. It did a little bit less damage than it received. I mean, honestly, if I'm going to tweak this lance, again, I'm dropping the Stinger 100%. And, you know, if I still have to work within that 130, you know, point value, I might be dropping the Archer. You know, I might be downgrading the Archer to like a Wolverine or something that's a tough medium, a Shadowhawk. There's a couple great Shadowhawk variants in Alpha Strike. And bring that Stinger up a little bit to something with some more armor. I mean, even 4 pips. And we'll see that Phoenix Hawk. Such a great mech. So speaking of which, why don't we jump over to the Battle Lance and see what the numbers look like there. All right, here we are, the Battle Lance. I love this one. I mean, I love the Marauder and, you know, of course, the Archer, Valkyrie, great models. The thing I love about the Battle Lance, the new Phoenix Hawk is stunning. The new Warhammer, such a cool, just a fantastic design, I think. Really captures what you expect that mech to be. The new Rifleman's really neat as well. I've had a couple where I've cut them into pieces and modded them and reposed them. So really neat stuff. I love the Battle Lance. I was able to get this within 1 point of the Command Lance. There was a configuration where I had them equal in point value, but I think one of the, you know, had like 3 4s and the other one had like a 2, and it was very like, it ended up being very weird. So the 1 point difference, they're actually much better distribution in terms of skill. And what we have here, let's talk through it. So this is my Draconis Combine Battle Lance, by the way. So what I tried to do, and I know the Rifleman is a Davian variant, but whatever. I took all of the K variants, which are all Draconis Combine variants. So I got the Warhammer 6K, the Phoenix Hawk 1K, the Wasp 1K, and then the Rifleman 4D. Here's what we got. So let's talk about the Warhammer. Love this mech. Overheat 1, great at short and medium range, not bad at long range. Its big weakness is its armor. I think we all know this, both from the lore and and also on the tabletop, whether it's classic or Alpha Strike. Only has 5 pips of armor, 6 points of structure. Anytime I see a mech with more structure than armor, it's like natively it scares me. This mech is an elite, so skill 2, very cool. And I put it in a Vanguard role. I did play it in a whole bunch of different roles, including direct fire, which basically follows up the Vanguard, but keeps a little bit more of a distance, has a little bit more bias towards survivability. So I tried a few different things, but Vanguard was where this thing really excelled, so that's where I put it. Rifleman 4D, this is a veteran. This one I put in a direct fire role. So this is backing up that Warhammer and the Phoenix Hawk as well. It is focusing on survivability because, like the Warhammer, it's got less armor than structure, only 4 pips of armor, 5 pips of structure, but it does have that massive Overheat 2. I love this mech. This is the one I play in my Atrian Knights Command Lance, Vegas, right? Her infamous Rifleman. This is just such a great thing when you wallop somebody at medium range for 4 points of damage, coming out of, a 32-point mech, right, which is the adjusted point value at the veteran level. It's really, really good, I think. So the key here is keeping this mech alive. The next one is the Phoenix Hawk K. This thing, you'll see, it's a performer. It's good. 35 points, it's not cheap. It's actually more than the Rifleman. It is a veteran, and I put it in the Vanguard because it's got 5 pips of armor. It doesn't have jump jets like some of the other Phoenix Hawks, but so much armor, solid structure. It's got that TMM of 2, which does help keep it alive. So it's very good, and it does have ENE as well, the 1K. The Wasp 1K, so this is also a skill 3 mech. Again, it's like this. It's basically the Stinger. Identical, statistically. I just made it a little bit better on the skill side. We'll see if that pays off. So looking at the force metrics, right, just those general, that sort of power bar, if you will. So this lance, very good in terms of speed. So, it's a little bit faster. The other lance was a 4.8. This is a 5.0. In terms of armor and structure, interestingly enough, the armor is not great at 4. The structure is actually higher on average than the armor, which is, again, very, very concerning. Crits abounding, which is consistent with what we saw, right? We saw the Command Lance was delivering more crits than it received, and probably because this particular, its opponent, this Battle Lance, really just, again, more structure than armor. On the skill side, so this is a little bit better than the Command Lance, 2.8, and then in terms of that weighted damage, it's actually identical at 2.4. If we look at the distribution, those sort of wheel charts on the different range brackets, you'll see that this lance stronger at short and medium range, less so at long and extreme than the Command Lance that it's up against. So same thing in terms of the unit era, tech base, formation, all that stuff along the bottom, right? We're just doing basic inner sphere succession wars stuff here. And then, I'm sorry, jumping around back to the right side there, just one important note about the PV distribution. You can see the Warhammer takes up a large majority of the points here, right? It's your skill 2, it's your elite. The Phoenix Hawk actually comes in second. We mentioned that earlier, a few more points than the Rifleman, and then the Wasp trailing. So when I think about the balance here, this lance, I think, is a little bit more balanced in terms of PV. And if I probably brought that Warhammer down to skill, 3, obviously it would change the whole PV dynamic, but you'd have a much more even distribution between the Warhammer, the Rifleman, and that Phoenix Hawk. So less outliers here. Interested to see how it stacks up. So let's start with the Warhammer, and we'll go from there. Okay, so again, a 44 point. This is a big guy. So looking at the core battle metrics, so the damage soaked actually goes off the chart on this one. This thing only has a survivability of 8.3%, I believe that says. So this thing gets absolutely nuked, but it doesn't go down alone. It's taking some bad guys with them. It does 8.2 points of damage. It soaks 10.6. And again, one thing I wanted to bring up earlier, the engine does track overkill. I went back and forth in the code, and I was like, do I want to cap it? Like, if I've got 2 points left and I deal 3 or I deal 4, do I want to track it, or do I want to, just cap it? And I decided to track it because I think it's more representative of the capability. I didn't want to like kneecap a certain mech because, it wastes an entire Alpha Strike, to kill a mech with 2 or 3 pips. Right, I wanted to make sure I captured that damage, and as long as I felt like as long as it was accounted for on both the damage dealt and the damage soaked, at least in my mind, I feel like that was a nice even representation and sort of, again, reflected the damage that the mech was capable of doing or receiving. So this one, it's a 10.6. It actually has, it has 11 pips, I believe. So again, it still survives 8.3% of the time. It's not dead all the time. So that's why that one's on over 11. But anyway, wanted to go on that digression, down that rabbit hole. So in terms of criticals, though, dealing 1.8, taking 2.9. Again, thanks to whatever designer decided that, heat sinks are more important than a couple more tons of armor. I don't know. It is what it is. But when we look at the armor degradation, this thing's like, it's doing pretty good. It's like turn 1, 2, 3, just kind of doing its thing. And then it gets absolutely obliterated. Somewhere between turn 4 and 5, you're already in internal structure. You're already taking critical hits. And as we know, not just the 12s and the 2s, but a weapon hit, a sensor hit, like a fire control, I should say. Like those things can absolutely, completely mess up the efficiency of a mech on the table. In terms of damage dealt, did 15.1%, and the PV is 17.1%. So efficiency on this one is 88.3%. It's not where I would want it to be, but it is over the average for all of the mechs in this particular fight. Again, that average being 86.1%, this guy at 88.3%. All right, so let's look at the grid in the middle. It's not doing anything fancy in this particular sim. I mean, this thing's basically marching up the middle. It does a little bit of a pull, to the right, to its right, I think, to kind of put more distance in between that trio of mechs coming up from the command lance, but it really just gets right back in it. Looking at the force metrics on the right, I want to focus on that center. Look at the combined damage dealt and soaked. That's important, right? The combined amount is important because it's not just, hey, you dealt this damage, but taking fire off your lance mates is important. And this thing is, in fact, a fire magnet, but it's still able to hang in there and go blow for blow and put some damage on the opposing mechs. You can see that Phoenix Hawk, dude, capitalizing. The Warhammer's just getting nuked, and the Phoenix Hawk's like, pew, 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 pew. So it was really cool to see how well the Phoenix Hawk did. And, it's sort of, we'll talk about it when we get there, but underscores the importance of not ignoring the little guys, because they can really rack up some damage. Anyway, in terms of efficiency, so at the bottom there, you can see the Warhammer, the Rifleman, the Phoenix Hawk, the Wasp. They're all right there. The mean of the average, the mean efficiency for this particular lance is 92.4%. So the Warhammer hanging in at about 88%. The Rifleman just about there too. You can see the Phoenix Hawk exceeding the Wasp, obviously not doing so hot. But overall, as far as how this mech performed, I would have liked to see a higher efficiency score, but it's not bad. It's performing above average, even though it's getting absolutely decimated early in the game. So overall, can't complain about the performance of the Warhammer here. I definitely think it's a mech that, I would take not only in this lance, but others as well. Despite that armor, structure issue that it does have, I think it's well worth its weight. All right, so the Rifleman, as I mentioned, this was one of my favorites. Just an excellent low low-cost mech, and I was interested to see, was it going to hold up? You know, was it, in Battlytics, was it going to do well? So this was a direct fire mech. So that means it's going to deploy somewhere near the vanguard. It is going to focus on cohesion, but it is going to prioritize its own survivability as well. It's going to try to stay at medium to long range. It's not hard-coded where it's like stay at medium and long range. It does look at its optimized damage, its chance to hit. It weights like, should I close in and get that kill shot, or should I maintain my range and try to survive another turn? It calculates like, you know, something like 70 or 80 different moves, and then, you know, basically looks at the position of itself relative to everybody else and calculates all these different scores. It's pretty crazy. So it's not just like trying to stay at long range, but you can see from the movement in the center, it definitely takes its time getting in. It's only sprinting basically on that first turn, and then it's opening fire, which is great. So I was hoping to see some really strong damage output from this thing. It was a little bit lackluster. I almost wonder if I should have made this mech the skill 2 mech, and how that would have changed potentially the dynamics of this match, because again, it's sitting at longer range. You can see the average range is 15.9 inches. That's in that little icon to the right of the core battle metrics, that sort of little crosshairs. So it's definitely not getting that close. It's hanging primarily at long range, still able to deal 2 points of damage, and on average in a game, it's dealing 6 points of damage. Now what you can see though is over those 5,000 simulations, that yellow area chart is pretty consistent from turn 2 all the way to turn 10. It's basically delivering, 2 points, as much as it can. Of course, that averages out with the hits and the misses. You're a little over a half a point. But it is relatively consistent in terms of the damage output, which to me, in a game of all the, the dice and variability, having a little bit of reliability to fix your strategy on is very important. Damage soaked, it does really well early in the game because things aren't shooting it. And then once you get into like turn 8, turn 9, that's where it really starts to fall apart. You can see the armor analysis there, the degradation. It drops off pretty quickly. Critical wise, it's doing about the same number of crits as it's taking. So it's 2-0 versus 2-3. That's pretty close. Overall survivability for this mech is 34.2%. For a mech with 9 pips and only 4 pips of armor, right? So 9 total. That's pretty good. So let's look at the damage and the PV. So it's 11.2%. That's its slice of damage on the battle grid, and it's taking up 12.5% of the total PV. So that's not bad. It's still not over 100%. Again, what you really want to see is you want to see the yellow number bigger than the purple. That's when you know you got a really good, you had a good run. For this one, it's not bad. We're at about, what is that, 89.8%, about 90%. So it's still in that, like, good range. Again, wonder if I put a better skill pilot in there, I think you would see, a much better return. But just didn't have the points to play with, I think. Again, wondering, I don't know. Now I'm going to kind of go back and play with things, like if I would have dropped the Warhammer down and maybe increased the Rifleman and the Phoenix Hawk. I don't know. I probably didn't have the points for it, but regardless. So overall, Rifleman's not bad. I think it's a great mech, one of my favorites. Did pretty well in this particular scenario. Not like outstandingly blew my socks off, but did really well. I think it's a solid stand-up performer here. If we look at the survivability on the right, you can see it's doing much better than its peers. In its lance, it's holding its own in terms of damage and damage taken. Again, really feel like it should have done more damage, but numbers are the numbers. All right, so it comes in at a pretty reasonable point cost, 32 points, I believe. Did we say 35 points for the Phoenix Hawk? It doesn't have an overheat value, and it doesn't even have long range. It's just 3 at short, 2 at medium, and this thing chews up the battlefield. I mean, look at the damage taken and the damage received. So this, again, we talked about this earlier. This underscores why you can't just ignore stuff, because this thing basically runs rampant for like 9 turns. It gets 12.9 points of average damage Again, we're averaging it over the 5,000 simulations at an average range of 5.4 inches. So, I mean, this thing's just basically running up. It's getting into short range, and it's just nuking things as best as it can. It's only taking 3.7 points of damage. It does 3.3 crits for receiving 0.8. That's fantastic. You couldn't ask for a better mech. Survives 78% of the time. Its armor analysis, it's not really seeing crits on average until late in the game. Turn 9, turn 10. Again, it's got 5 pips. It's really good. I mean, it's got basically the same armor as the Warhammer, just less structure. So very, very good design in my opinion. It's doing 23.9% of the damage, and it's only taking 13.6% of the PV pool up. That's a good return on investment. That efficiency rating, 175.2%. And if you look, it's very interesting. It's actually below average until turn 4. So it takes it some time because it has no ability to shoot. It's just sprinting into medium range. And once it gets there around turn 4, it's just immediately getting a good ROI. And that just continues to climb until the end of the game. If we look at the movement profile, I love this one particularly. This particular simulation, because I love the way the Phoenix Hawk just kind of picks up the target and just chases it down. You can see it makes a really intelligent sort of inside out flanking maneuver. It gets in, it sprints early. The thing just does so much damage in this particular setup. So if you're playing against a battle lance, take the Phoenix Hawk out. I mean, honestly, it's a tough lance because if you didn't take the Phoenix Hawk out, you're left contending with that Warhammer, which can deal 4 points with the overheat. So I think overall, and we'll talk about this at the end, I think this battle lance is much better designed and much more balanced than the command lance. But anyway, so the Phoenix Hawk doing really well. It actually does the most damage out of any unit on the battle grid, period. It also has the highest efficiency out of any unit on the battle grid, period. I would say that this mech will give you solid performance no matter what kind of lance it's in. It could be the big guy in a little lance. It could be the little guy in a big lance. It does not matter. It's got the armor and the speed. It's one of those like Wolverine-esque mechs where it's like right in that sweet spot. And it is not cheap. Mid-30s is not a cheap mech. I mean, a Zeus is only 40 points, I think, like a 5T or something like that. So it's not cheap, but again, really good ROI for this particular mech. On the flip side, we got the Wasp. I don't know. Did okay. This is adorable. Again, taking these little tiny itty bitty mechs and putting them in with these things like Marauders and Archers and Warhammers, like, God bless. They're just not going to perform. I was interested to see if the skill 3 would have made a difference, but it doesn't, because the thing's basically dead before it even gets a chance. In fact, the average, the damage output is 0.6. It's identical to the Stinger. Thing gets blown to pieces. It only does 0.1 critical hits. It's taking 1.6. It's just, the only difference in the Stinger is that it actually survived 0.1% of the games, which is a step up. But yeah, I mean, there's just not much to say here. These little mechs, when they're put in an arena with big mechs, that TMM2 is just not enough to skew the probability curve to make a difference. Efficiency on this one, 16.4%. Obviously well below the average, really not that fantastic. You can see on the top right there, the force metrics, the survivability, it just immediately tanks, just like the armor. And then, similar to the Stinger, it's doing its best. It's deployed on an outside strike roll. It's trying to move in as quickly as it can to deal the damage, but it's lasting 3, 4, maybe 5 turns at best. I mean, you can even see in the core battle metrics, it's really not taking damage in the late game, because by time it gets to turn 5, turn 6, it's dead almost 100% of the time. 0.1% of the time it survives. So, not much to say here about the Wasp and the Stinger. I don't think they're bad mechs. Again, I just don't think they belong in a fight. It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight. They just don't belong in this arena with these bigger mechs that can literally one-shot it with an overheat. So, that's that. Let's take a look at the overall combined statistics for the Battle Lance. All right, so there we are. We got our depth chart up in the top right. You know, again, good speed, decent armor. Actually, not decent armor. It's got mediocre armor and slightly better structure. Skill is below average, meaning better than average, because the lower the skill, the better. It's at 2.8, and then again, that weighted damage is about 2.4, which is pretty, pretty average, I think, for a lance of this particular size. So not bad. You could probably eke a bit more out of both of these lances, the battle and the command lance. Again, if you sort of tweak the numbers a bit. If we look at the core battle metrics, this is the inverse of what we looked at on the command lance. So in terms of damage dealt, 27.7, damage soaked is 26.4. So early game, it's being outperformed by the command lance, but then, later in the game, once that Phoenix Hawk gets into play, turn 5 and beyond, you can see that this lance is doing more damage on average than its counterpart, than the OP4. It is not doing as well on the critical side. I mean, it's still pretty much a 1-to-1, but slightly worse. 7.1 crits delivered to 7.5 taken. Average range is 7.7, so a little bit closer than what we saw, I believe, on the command lance. Command lance was 8.3. So yeah, so this one, they're getting a little bit closer, which makes sense. I mean, they want to. The Warhammer's a closer range mech. The Phoenix Hawk's a closer range mech. Only that Rifleman really designed to stay, I think, a little further back. Overall efficiency, so 92.4% for this particular lance. Again, that's your blended lance efficiency, which is much better than the command lance. Command lance was 79.8. So at the end of the day, not 92.4 is not bad. So as it looks right now, the battle lance should win this particular shootout. One thing that the Alpha Strike Battlytics engine does, because it's doing a full game of basically 4-on-4, is it's tracking wins, losses, and draws. Draw is very rare. Draw is when I shoot you, you shoot me, on the same turn we kill each other, there's nothing left on the table, right? So that doesn't happen very often. There are points when there are units left on both sides, and at that point it takes a look at what's the PV of the unit, how much armor and structure does it have left, what criticals does it take, and what's it capable of doing, basically, and it factors all that in and then decides who's the winner and who's the loser. If I have 4 mechs on the table but they all have 1 pip of structure and 3 weapon hits each, and you've got 1 fresh Atlas on the table, you're going to win, right? So it sort of extrapolates who's going to win, even though it kind of caps it at the 10 turns. Anyway, are you guys ready to check out the final results? All right, so here they are, the final numbers. Wins, losses, draws. So again, this was 5,000, this particular one, 5,000 games of Alpha Strike. These lances, locked and loaded 5,000 times and went at it. The win, loss, and draws from the perspective of the first force we looked at. So the win to loss ratio, 49.8% to 50.1%. That means the command lance lost 50.1% of the time. It means the battle lance won 50.1% of the time. There was 0.1% draw, and that's basically all she wrote. So that battle lance, more efficient, doing slightly better, winning about 1%, actually less than 1%, like 0.3% more, which is excellent, and I'll talk about that in just a moment here. But let's look at some of the key metrics. So our sort of depth chart, if you will: speed, armor, structure, skill, firepower. So the light green line is our command lance. The dark green line is our battle lance. So what do we see here? Well, what we see is battle lance is faster, command lance has more armor. That actually ended up with the same structure. The battle lance, as we knew, has better skill, right? That darker green line lower, meaning it's got, it had the elite, so better there. And then their weighted damage was the same, which is interesting because, again, it's looking at, short, medium, long. It's looking at double the medium plus half the extreme. It's quite a calculation. So for them to come out identical. It was pretty interesting. All right, so right below that in the green bars, we're looking at the percent by each individual lance, how the PV broke down. So in Force 1, we know the Archer was the big boy there, 36.4%. And the second lance, the Warhammer, was the big one at 34.4%. So what's interesting is even though the Warhammer was an elite pilot and that Archer was only a veteran, right, skill 3 versus skill 2 on the Warhammer, the Archer still took up more points. Like you can see the Marauder and the Archer together are at, what's that, 68, 69% of the total lance. So you can, we talked about this earlier, that battle lance has a much more even distribution of points from the Warhammer to the Rifleman to the Phoenix Hawk, whereas the command lance, lagging on basically 2 of the 4 mechs. I think that as we do more of these analyses, you're going to find lances where there's a better and tighter balance across the mechs is going to be superior to lances where you can single out and quick kill a mech, or if there is one like lumbering giant and a bunch of garbage, and you take out that one big mech and they've got nothing left on the board, right? It's a lot easier to deal when you can isolate a threat and eliminate it versus when you have 4 mechs that are slightly different but have relatively same armor and structure profiles, relatively same speed profiles, right? They operate very well, in tandem as a unit. It's a lot harder to fight those units than it is when there's just sort of a mishmash of random things, because it's easier to exploit the mishmash. Anyway, let's look at the center. So the center is a side-by-side comparison of some of our key metrics. So again, that yellow pie chart representing the total damage dealt. We've talked about this already. 48.8% on the command lance, 51.2% on the battle lance. The battle lance being on the right, the command lance being on the left. And then we've got average range, damage dealt, damage soaked, critical hits taken, and then the white donut charts there, survivability. So the battle lance outperforming basically on just about every metric except for critical hits. When we look at the overall damage, so the right below that, the damage totals, right, the yellow bars, the Archer and the Phoenix Hawk really are the standout mechs. The Marauder coming in third place there. And actually, if we look at the Archer did 12.69, Phoenix Hawk did 12.89, so actually much closer than I thought. But the Phoenix Hawk taking first place, the Archer taking second, the Marauder coming in third. But after that, it's Warhammer, Rifleman, and then the Valkyrie, the Stinger, the Wasp, almost non-contributory. I think the Valkyrie not doing that bad, but you can see, the Rifleman, which was a kind of a weak mech, almost doubling with that Valkyrie, actually more than doubling what the Valkyrie did, just by a little bit. And then if we look at the overall efficiency there on the right, so there's a very clean representation of the two forces side by side. You can see the white lines, the white hashes representing sort of a marker for average efficiency for that particular force, for that lance. So the command lance at the 79.8, the battle lance at 92.4. So overall, battle lance doing much better in terms of bang for buck. But you can see that the Warhammer, the Rifleman, even though the Marauder and the Archer outperformed them, that Phoenix Hawk really making up the difference there, whereas the Valkyrie, the Stinger, the Wasp, again, just not really pulling their weight here. So what's my sort of final assessment here? So if I think about the mechs involved, I think we know how great the Marauder is. I think we know how great the Archer is. I'm actually surprised the Archer did so well because I find it a little bit more expensive, for me, the extra crap like the LRMs and the indirect fire and all that stuff, it's not really worth the point value. Having the rear mounted lasers, like I don't care. I'd rather take a Marauder than an Archer, although that extra point of armor I think really is what you pay for. I will say one fun note: the engine also is capable of it knows how to use NARC and AMS and the LRM and SRM special ability. So that wasn't featured here, but I had some pretty cool tests with like the Stalker and the Archer with like the Stalker 5M, I think, what has the NARC beacon, and the Orion with the NARC beacon. So some cool stuff coming up in the future. I'm also working on coding in all the C3 stuff, so we'll be able to really be able to see. I could do like a side-by-side of C3 on and C3 off, so you can see, how much better it is. But there's so much to consider there with the C3. It's mind-boggling. Just from a strategy perspective, like would the mechs move and behave differently? Would they be willing to sacrifice a mech to get it in close so everything has a better hit radius? Anyway, back to this. So efficiency on this particular sort of group of mechs. Marauder's great, Archer's great. Warhammer, I'm actually not surprised about. Again, it's that one of those mechs that I think has potential, but the lack of armor I really struggle with. The Rifleman, I was expecting a little bit more out of. Both the Rifleman and the Warhammer, I think, did great. They're in the high 80s. I think that's acceptable in this particular battle setup. The Phoenix Hawk was totally, just blew me away at 175%. I mean, this mech, I think, was in the right role. I think it's in a really good lance. I think, typically you're looking at the Warhammer, you're looking at the Rifleman. You're like, do I want to waste, fire shooting at this stupid Phoenix Hawk? Yes, is the answer, by the way, because if you don't, I mean, it's just racking up 3 points. It's going to get real close. It's going to have very low target numbers. So that one to me was the standout. But I think that's all stuff that you guys know. Now, just kind of going back, one thing, just thinking about some of my comparos I've done in Battlytics for Classic, where I've taken mechs that have, very similar BV, battle value, and they come out wildly different in the simulation, right? They do like wildly different amounts of damage at different range. It's like, it's very hard to balance, I find, with PV. With this, I was actually very happy with the results, and this was not doctored. This just is the way it came out. You have two lances that are within 1 point value of each other, and the win-loss draw ratio came out almost identical, which is what you would hope. And again, you're playing 5,000 games of BattleTech, so even though we can use Battlytics to say this is where this lance can be exploited. This is, this was the weak link on the lance, right? Like, for example, in the command lance, the Marauder and the Archer are pulling all the weight. The Valkyrie and the Stinger, they're not doing a lot. Like, we can see that, but even still, and that probably contributed to why they lost more than they won, even though I think they had the 1 point advantage. But at the end of the day, I think having the point value be balanced in such a way is very meaningful, and I think it's really cool from just the overall Alpha Strike perspective. All right, guys, so that wraps it up. I think we're going to bring this one to a close. Our first Alpha Strike Battlytics analysis of the Command Lance and the Battle Lance. So a couple of exciting things here. More of this stuff to come. Open to ideas. We can do, basically up to a 5v5, so I could look at, some of the clan stars that are out there in the box sets, or some of our own stuff like our house units and things like that we have, or we can even analyze some of the prior games that we've done and how those mechs might perform. So very cool stuff there. Also on Patreon, guys, we are having an Alpha Strike bracket tournament. So everybody that's at the veteran level in Patreon gets to submit their lance and set the rolls and set the skill levels. I'll have a PV threshold, and then in February I'm going to set up a bracket tournament, and the winner gets painted mechs, a lance of painted mechs, their choice, painted by none other than Colonel Matthew Steiner. So I may have mentioned this before in one of our Hyperpulse uplinks, but some really nice mechs, some Arcturian Guard, and then also some Draconis Combine, the Ryukin. So very, just really cool mechs. Maybe I'll flash up a couple pictures if I'm not feeling too lazy. What else? Well, I do want to tell you guys that if you want to get some box sets, head over to Aries Games and Minis. Best prices you're going to find, excellent customer service. Derek is absolutely awesome, so don't forget to check him out over there. And of course, guys, you can always check us out on Instagram, on Facebook. You can get our soundtrack, which is fantastic. That is on all the major streaming platforms. You can just ask Alexa or whatever to play Death from Above Wargaming. You can check it out on iTunes and Spotify and so on and so forth. And we actually have a second album in the works. It's really cool. It's coming along really nicely. So I think you guys will enjoy that. But that's it, guys. That's all I got. So stay tuned. Thank you for your patience during our little hiatus here. But I think we're back in action. So Kevin and I are very excited to get a battle report going for you guys. So hopefully we'll have that out to you probably next week. But thanks again, as always, guys. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. If you want to help us out, head on over to Patreon and check that out. But more than anything else, guys, stay tuned and keep watching. Always great stuff coming from Death from Above Wargaming. Have a good night.